Despite the glamour of Curry and the Warriors' hot start, some people weren't fully convinced, which would become a theme over the next few seasons for both parties. It becomes slightly obvious as the year wore on that to cement their greatness, they'd eventually have to deal with LeBron and the Cavs, who had more visible star power and even more expectations coming into that season. So when Golden State took their 44-10 record up against Cleveland and lost in February, it confirmed what most people thought. This was a nice story, but it did not have a fairy tale finish. Not yet anyways. And then there was still the establishment of the West to deal with. The fact that they'd likely have to go through the Clippers and the Spurs, both teams they failed to conquer in the last couple of seasons. As for the Thunder, they'd been taken out of the running by injury per usual. And so with Klay Thompson making his first All-Star team, Golden State was on their way to replacing OKC as the young upstart with an impending takeover. Which wasn't necessarily a great thing for narratives, as the Thunder's injuries provided what many believed to be one of the many breaks the Warriors would get throughout this era. That agenda gained steam when Steph Curry won an MVP, posting very similar numbers to his 2014 campaign. But between him already beginning to hit shots that were previously considered ludicrous to even take, and the Warriors winning 67 games when they were probably expected to be a 4th or 5th seed at best, there was a new challenger to the throne. Yet, said challenger would be questioned from the very beginning, as people would complain he'd only won MVP by being the best player on the best team. To add to that, given the playoff formatting, the Spurs and Clippers faced each other in the first round, eliminating one major obstacle for the Golden Boys right off the bat. Meanwhile, they were busy sweeping the Pelicans, where Steph had his first truly iconic snapshot of the playoffs by hitting an impossible game-tying 3 in a game they very well may have lost. He was just getting started with these kind of theatrics. Curry would have 2 near 40-point games in the series as they'd cruise to the second round to play the Grizzlies. Again, a team that was considered second tier in terms of contending, but a legitimate challenge nonetheless. In fact, the grit and grind vets took a 2-1 lead, as many believed reality was beginning to set in for a team that really never been that far. But after some critical adjustments, Golden State won 3 straight to close out the series. However, the adjustments were not the story. The story would be A, how Curry had already been slowed down in just the second round, and B, how they'd only won because Mike Conley wasn't healthy, missing 1 game in the series and being bothered by the injury for the rest. And if they'd caught too many breaks to impress anybody already, now they were playing the Rockets in the conference finals instead of the Spurs or Clippers. Both teams had fallen in earlier rounds. Those were the matchups everyone had truly been waiting on. Rematches with their earliest rivals and the top dogs of the conference. Teams they could really make a statement against. Not to mention a healthy star point guard matchup for Steph. And if they still hadn't had enough luck, the Cavaliers were on the other side of the bracket dealing with injuries to their big 3. So, in other words, it was possible that the Warriors wouldn't have any trials difficult enough to gain the respect of a champion. In line with that, they made quick work of Houston as expected, while Curry regained his MVP groove, averaging 31, 5, and 4 on 49% from 3. And so, the literal season after being knocked out in the first round as a 6th seed, they'd all but breezed through what was supposed to be a brutal Western Conference on the way to a possible title. But that wouldn't come quite as easy, and there was the first true issue in a line of many.
To know how unexperienced we are as a unit playing together, I think that's special in its own right. No matter what happens from here on out, to see what we've accomplished being a first-year team together that's had different changes throughout the course of the season, has faced so many obstacles throughout the season, injuries here, transactions here, lineups here, something we can be very proud of to this point.
The Cavaliers were without Kevin Love, who was still deemed important at the time, so it appeared to be an uphill battle for LeBron and Cleveland from the start. Yet, they came out in Game 1 pushing the Warriors every bit as hard as it looked like LeBron would push a young team with no finals experience. On top of that, the confidence Kyrie radiated gave the impression that he hadn't even acknowledged the fact he was up against the league's newest golden boy. The Cavs, sans Kevin Love, looked fully capable of at very least taking this series the distance, with the very real possibility of winning it. And of course, that was around the time that Kyrie would go down with a series-ending knee injury. Boom. No matter what happened now, Steph and the Warriors could never win. Sweeping the Cavs would just prove how easy they now had it. Going the distance would have proved that they couldn't have beaten them healthy. Either way, LeBron was up against a juggernaut with yet another roster not seen as fit for the finals, and the narratives were officially born. Not only did the series go the distance, but Curry struggled to find his MVP rhythm early on, at times looking to be challenged by Kyrie's stand-in phenom Matthew Dellavedova. That was all anybody needed to be convinced that he and the Warriors were imposters. Would a champion like the Spurs have struggled to put away a squad starting Timothy Mozgov off in Delhi, the Warriors would eventually win, but not before being pushed to the absolute brink. And Curry did respond in those moments. But because he'd been slowed and sometimes even shown up by a virtual no-name at the start of the series, and because of Iguodala's defensive numbers against LeBron, he failed to cap off the magical season with Finals MVP honors. There was even a movement urging voters to give it to LeBron regardless of a win or loss. Thus, the beginning of a long line of questions people needed to answer to believe in Curry, and by association, the Warriors. This was a honeymoon season. They came out of nowhere and had everything go their way. Could they respond like the true champions before them in more dire situations? Well, they'd surely get their fair share of shots. Curry had clearly heard the disrespect, as before the season started, he let out in an interview that he was sorry the Warriors were healthy and that they'd played who was in front of them. He apologized for their accolades, adding that they'd rectify the situation in the coming year. Not sure anybody really heeded the warning. Led by his massive improvement, the Warriors would start the season at a blistering 24-0, leaving not even the slightest question about whether they deserved everything they've gotten so quickly. On top of that, Curry visually and statistically improved probably more than any MVP we'd ever seen. So much so that there was discussions he may have been the most improved player. On this pace, Curry would go on to up his averages by 7 to 30 points a game, throwing in 7 assists, 5 rebounds, a league-leading 2 steals a game, all in a 50-45-90 season. But more impressive than his stats were how he was getting them. Sure, a lot of it was great offense generating good looks, but this was the season he completely lifted the boundaries of what it meant to shoot a basketball. He was now launching from distances that began discussions of whether a 4-point line was needed. This all culminated to a night in OKC nonetheless, who were finally healthy and back on the scene. But were they really? This game would say it all. Curry had injured his ankle that game, once again bringing up fears about what seemed to be his kryptonite. Still, at some point he'd return, calmly sitting near the scorer's table ready to make history. The 46 points and 12 assists he'd finished with were nearly beside the point. Off of a terrible Westbrook miss, Curry would take just a few dribbles up court before letting one gracefully go near the logo. Game. Although this was only their 53rd win with much of the season left to be played, Curry had delivered his signature moment for the season, perfectly encapsulating what was happening. The game was changing, he was ascending, and the Warriors were unstoppable because of it. To top it off, there could not have been a better way to show that they'd stolen OKC's thunder as the upstart in the West. KD and Westbrook were electric, no doubt, but at this specific point in time, their chance had seemed to have come and gone. These golden kids, Steph Curry, they'd done what the Thunder had been trying to do for 5 years in around 2. The Warriors would also beat Cleveland in both regular season meetings, in one of which Curry said he'd hoped that the Cavs locker room still smelled like champagne from the previous championship. This all en route to finishing the season by just barely beating the Bulls' record. 72-10 was no more. Curry had also broken the record for most threes in a season, netting 402 of them, compared to his sharpshooting partner's 276, once again overshadowing one of the greatest shooters of all time by miles. The Warriors as a whole had tallied 1,077 treys, and Curry ran away with the first unanimous MVP in NBA history. Given these situations and stories developing, perhaps it added a bit more sting that just a few years earlier, that honor was absolutely supposed to have gone to LeBron. Yet, people may have missed the most important part of that year. The Warriors had officially figured out what was affectionately named the Death Lineup. Well, in reality, this was something they'd found out was effective back in the 2015 finals when they were struggling to put away a damaged Cleveland team. But early on in this season, when they were still undefeated and going against the Clippers, it looked like they'd once again ran into a real challenge, something they were going to have to deal with at some point. However, it was in this game they discovered their death lineup did not just work against teams they outclassed in talent. It also worked to close gaps when they were at a strategic disadvantage. The Clippers had somewhat been their equals for a while because they could play big while also still being very fast given their athletic front line. With their death lineup, the Warriors could also play big without actually having one on the floor, while still enjoying the speed and shooting of a smaller lineup. So when they climbed out of a large deficit to win that game, the Clippers were never truly a threat to them again, and the league was in for a tough few years. Having Curry at the head of this lineup, they could simply blitz teams, and often end games within 3 quarters. He stretched the floor so far with his gravity that squads simply did not have the physical tools to respond. It was like watching magic. Golden State would make quick work of the Rockets in the first round, who'd fallen off that season, and that was even without Steph. In game 1, he'd once again fell victim to what seemed to be his only weakness, tweaking his ankle with no apparent visual culprit. Upon returning from that, he slipped on a recently tracked wet spot, nearly tearing ligaments in his knee, which turned out just to be a sprain. The problem was that they were in the playoffs and he did not have the time to get back to 100%. The Warriors would do without him until he returned in the Portland series, unleashing a furious 40-point outing, crushing any chance the Blazers may have thought they had. Curry exclaimed that he was back during the onslaught, and the Warriors moved on shortly after. It's worth noting here that the Blazers had been replacements for the again injured Clippers squad they were supposed to meet, but by this point there was a clear gap between the two, so only the hardest of haters tried to use it as a slight. But then they ran up against the Thunder, and at long last, there was nowhere left to run. Finally, they'd been put face to face with the truest of challenges. No injuries, no consolation squad, just the team they'd replaced over the last few seasons, and OKC clearly felt a way about it. The only injuries in this series were Steph's, who clearly was no longer at his MVP level. While great, he wasn't cutting the same, didn't have the same speed changing directions, and he overall just was not as shifty. So while he could still muster up an incredible outing, they weren't coming nearly as easy as they had before he went down. This aided the Thunder in going up 3-1, as they could put out lineups that were big but still quick enough to stick with the Warriors' scariest lineups. As Iguodala put it, they were the best team in that year's playoffs. But in storybook-like fashion, they could not finish the champs. Steve Kerr made adjustments to bait Kevin Durant into shots that took the team out of rhythm, and in Game 6, facing elimination, Klay Thompson exploded, all but saving the team and delivering them safely back to Oracle for a 7th game. Although Curry had also put in 31 points with 10 rebounds, his 9 of 22 shooting was not typical of the golden performances people were accustomed to in 2016, and given that Klay was the savior, there was yet another narrative and questions surrounding just how great Steph Curry actually was, even if said questions were completely nonsensical by this point. His 36-point Game 7 performance seemed to have answered that anyways, but it's mostly lost to history now. If any team were to come back 3-1 on a squad like the Thunder, it would absolutely be the 73-9 Warriors. And so although nobody had known it yet, history was on its way to being set. For the first part, Draymond Green had brutally kicked Steven Adams in one of these games, inching him closer toward the threshold for suspension, although many believed he should have been suspended right there on the spot. But most importantly, Kevin Durant had been rumored to have been eyeing Golden State for free agency, as they were definitely eyeing him. So much so that Andrew Bogut made it known he didn't exactly like the idea of it because it didn't seem to be a need, aka his job there was obviously at stake with a Durant addition. But would that really happen anyways? Would Durant ditch this project he'd been working on in OKC to join a team that taken the opportunities from them, especially with just having come within one game of the NBA Finals? Seemed more like a fairy tale. Speaking of which, the Warriors were ready to write their ending too. All they had to do now was send a healthy Cavs team on their way, and they would have answered every question anyone had ever asked over the last 2 years, defeated every narrative. In the first 2 games, they'd done just that, pretty much outclassing the Cavs as had come to be expected by that point, and after 4 games, the Warriors were up 3-1, led by a 38-point outing from the MVP himself. The series was over now. The greatest team of all time was on the brink of solidifying themselves as such, leaving no stone unturned on the way throughout the year. This was without Curry being at 100%. Except, Draymond Green had once again landed a shot below the belt, this time leading to his suspension for Game 5. Problem was, if the Warriors had won the series, Green, the newest Warrior All-Star that year, likely would have taken Finals MVP honors. Still, Klay Thompson found it within himself to gloat a little bit, telling the press LeBron may have gotten his feelings hurt. That was the beginning of the end, though nobody had realized it. The Warriors began Game 5 looking ready to pop champagne, also looking very spry. It's just that LeBron and Kyrie were also very spry, and they had different ideas. To make matters worse, a good way through it, they'd lose Andrew Bogut for good through a nasty knee injury. Their screen setting, rim protecting stalwart was gone, and Draymond Green for this game was gone as well. With no usual Curry explosion, the Warriors had no chance of closing out that night, and so back to Cleveland it was. James not only dominated in Game 6, but Curry looked inferior. He was A, blocked in a very demeaning way by LeBron, we'll never know what was said but we can imagine, and B, thrown out of the game as his team was being pounced upon, tossing his mouthpiece shortly before his wife took to Twitter to call the game rigged. None of this was a particularly good look for the new chosen one, or his gang of perfectionists. And so, one more game. The most important game of the Golden Dynasty, and possibly Curry's legacy. He was awful. His shots weren't falling, he was turning the ball over, he looked human. A little too human. It was as if the veil had come down and every detractor who had ever said he was just regular seemed right for the moment. In the most important moment of his golden season, the difference between he and LeBron, the actual best player in the league, could not have been more visible. And if it all hadn't have been bad enough, the Cavaliers purposely switched his superstar point guard matchup on him for the dagger. They hunted him, and that would officially destroy the greatest season of all time. Furthermore, had had the Warriors had actually won, Draymond Green was having a Game 7 for the ages, and he almost certainly would have been awarded the MVP, with Curry again not being able to be the most important player in the most important series. None of this was garnering enough respect for him to be mentioned in the same breath as LeBron, as he had been so many times that season. There aren't even words to put together how impossible it all was. There really aren't words needed. It speaks for itself. Meanwhile, Draymond Green was allegedly in the parking lot talking to Kevin Durant, enticing him to come fix this situation. Part of the reason they lost were that Curry's teammates couldn't hit shots to alleviate pressure Cleveland was applying to him defensively, especially including Harrison Barnes. Draymond essentially phoned in his replacement right then and there. Whatever the circumstances of this loss were and whether they could come back from heart-wrenching defeat like the Spurs did was irrelevant. If they could simply break the game by adding a top 3 player to a 73-win core, there would be no more talking. That Warriors core would visit Kevin Durant at the Hamptons, making the pitch of why they needed him and how they could use him. But the most important part of this ordeal was Curry. Was he really willing to share this massive spotlight he'd earned with another MVP level player? Was he willing to look past jersey and shoe sales for wins? Yes and yes. He made it abundantly clear to Durant that at any cost, he just wanted to win. And so they would. Regardless of how damaging it'd be to anybody's image, Durant accepted this invitation to come complete a dynasty in the making, and the rest truly is history. The 2017 Warriors left nothing to imagination, save for the time Durant got hurt and could have easily been lost for the season. However, in that time, Curry simply held it down, returning to MVP levels while his co-star was recovering. That was impressive, because the Warriors had given up more than people like to remember to acquire Kevin Durant, and they were no longer built to win it all without him. But that was all anybody really was impressed with or surprised by in those days. The fact that they'd built a practically unbeatable team meant whatever winnings came after, well, those were expected as long as they showed up. So when the Warriors went 16-1, defeating the Cavaliers in a rematch for the title, it felt more like a foregone conclusion than redemption. As Richard Jefferson would put it years later, they went and called Big Brother after getting beat up. Sure, they'd won, but it didn't seem to take the sting out of what had happened. And once again, while on that run, the one team that was supposed to challenge them in the West succumbed to injuries when Kawhi Leonard came down on Zaza's foot. This was essentially the same Spurs team that had been right behind them in the standings the whole year they were winning 73 games. It never really felt like anybody could beat them, but it didn't help anybody's perception when the only team that could didn't even get the chance. Still, the hatred for the Durant move fell much more on his shoulders than Curry's. For the most part, Curry just did his part, while people spent 3 years bullying KD to leave. Meanwhile, Steph simply dazzled with the space the super team afforded him and looked like the perfect teammate who'd shared some of his light for the betterment of the team. So when they came back and won again in 2018, it was much of the same story. They'd almost lost in the conference finals, and yet again, the only team that was slated as a challenge suffered a critical injury at a critical time. Chris Paul, with 1 game to go, popped a hammy, and that was all the daylight this Warriors squad needed to come back. Otherwise, Durant's newfound temptation to go off script in the offense may have done them in. Waiting for them at the end was yet again one of the worst finals rosters ever. And the juxtaposition given the optics were just terrible because the Warriors were one of the greatest rosters just in general. So they'd obviously cruised their way to victory. No story, no true adversity, lucky breaks once again, but the Golden Dynasty was here, and here to stay apparently. Worth mentioning that as Curry had ceded part of his spotlight, he was also still without a finals MVP now in 4 appearances. Durant won it both times, and with them being on the same team, it was pretty well understood that neither could add a regular season MVP to their resume. But they could add another name to the team. In summer 2018, a recently injured DeMarcus Cousins shocked the world by signing to be their starting center, which was particularly frightening because he didn't need to be himself for the Warriors to remain unbeatable, he just needed to be decent. And at bare minimum, he was expected to stretch the floor even further without them having to play small ball. In any case, Curry, who had been surrounded by the best team ever for 2 seasons now, was going into a third poised to three-peat, with a potentially even scarier one. Say what you might, but by this point, he and the Warriors had revolutionized basketball, relentlessly tagging teams from the 3-point line, making logo shots a regular occurrence, playing the most elite brand of small ball ever known to man. The Hampton Five, as they'd become to be known. If you wanted to win in this era, you needed to find a way to be effective with all 5 positions shooting the ball while still being able to maintain defense and rebounding. The Warriors had perfected it, better than maybe anyone will ever be able to. The influence would one day cause the Houston Rockets to play with nothing resembling a big man on the floor. Rookies such as Trae Young were coming into the league flinging from the logo, and Damian Lillard followed in Curry's path, extending the possibilities of the range of a 3-point shot. And when it was all said and done, still, nobody could do it like the Warriors could. This was a once-in-a-lifetime semblance of talent, and it was fairly obvious they could only lose to circumstance, which is exactly what they did. Not only did their chemistry fall apart in 2019, but their team did as well, with Cousins and KD sustaining crucial injuries that left the Warriors with their original core, minus any of the supporting pieces. That's what made their win over Houston in the second round that much more impressive. Finally, Harden's Rockets had them where they wanted. They were healthy, the Warriors were not, and they once again had nowhere to run and hide. They had to face this in front of the world. In Game 6, Curry was being quote-unquote exposed again with a scoreless first half that gave the feel that the Rockets could take this to 7 and win it. Given the fact that this would have meant the Rockets came back after Kevin Durant went down, the optics for Curry would not have been great. What would he have been without a healthy and elite squad? Well, a lot, as it turns out. He erupted. As he'd done many times before with the questions piling up, Curry poured in 33 points to finish the game, but most importantly, he finished the Rockets. He hit dagger after dagger on the road, totally draining the life from the building. No KD to take the pressure off, no Klay Thompson saving him narrative, just Steph Curry, ending the talks that they were finally vulnerable and about to be upstaged without any of the lucky breaks they'd always received. The Rockets were done, the Blazers never really stood a chance, and the Warriors were in their 5th straight finals. With a golden opportunity to win it without KD, by the way. This was again what everybody wanted. However, overcoming a tough Raptors team with Kawhi proved to be too much, especially after Klay Thompson went down in a close Game 6, allowing Toronto to go boxing 1 in a finals game. Many believe Golden State could have pulled it out if they just had Klay Thompson, Durant be damned. But if anything, Toronto's coverage of Curry with no other stars on the floor spoke to the respect he commanded over the years. Even if the narrative said he was only so successful because of his talent, teams weren't treating it that way. They would have rather have given a decent shooting teammate an open look than even have a portion of the basket in Curry's field of view. That was pretty much how the Cavaliers guarded him in 2016 to make sure he couldn't warm up. So despite Curry's best efforts in that series and in that last game, Toronto claimed the title and the golden era was over. And given all the disrespect and questions that had been put on his name, it was somewhat eerie that it all ended with him missing the final shot. It was anybody's guess what would happen next.
I mean, there's always an awareness of what the situation is going into any season. From a leadership perspective, it doesn't change much in terms of just what are the specific things that this team needs to be successful. Obviously, we have a lot of new guys, a lot of young guys. Myself, Klay, whenever he comes back, Draymond, Kevon, able to help set the tone for what our DNA is here, how we do things, our championship kind of mentality. But at the end of the day, it's just about continue to do things that help me be successful and help me lead, teams in the past, and just a level of awareness and trying to be as proactive as possible, making everybody feel comfortable, building chemistry, and leading by example. I don't have to change much in that respect.
2020 would be the lost year, as Curry would get injured right away, causing fans to claim he'd been saved. What would he have looked like for a full season when teams could focus on him the way they'd focus on other stars such as LeBron? He'd finally be exposed, right? We'd never know, because by the time he'd return in 2021, he'd have Klay back, and a shiny new draft pick to go with that to retool the Warriors for another run. Except Klay Thompson would unimaginably go down with a torn Achilles, all but leaving Curry to fend for himself for an entire year. We've got him now. That was the sentiment among his detractors, especially once he whiffed on his first few games, unable to get it going with so much defensive attention and no star help. A few more games into the regular season, and his legacy was on the line to some people. He had to come answer for the last 5 or 6 years of dominance, for tormenting teams with all these superstars around him and all this space. What was he going to be able to do without playing on cruise control? He would promptly respond, as he had many times already, though this time with one of the worst supporting casts in the league. And he did so by averaging his 2016 numbers for a while. Today, he sits at 29 points, 6 assists, 5 rebounds, 47% from the field, and 41% from 3. Speaking of 3, he's just surpassed Reggie Miller, the former GOAT shooter, with what he describes to be another 4 to 5 years left here with us. He'll pass the former GOAT shooter Ray Allen sometime next season. As for now, he's got no other all-stars, he's got no real bench, he's got no talent on the floor to alleviate the coverage he sees on offense, and still, he remains far and wide the greatest shooter of all time. and one of the best players the league has to offer. Although this season doesn't mean much for the Warriors, it was important for him to do what he's done. He didn't just falter to averaging career lows without a super team like his detractors predicted. He didn't just look like some regular shooter who benefited from a flawless system. He looks a lot like he was the system, and it's probably not over. At age 33, he's got a lot of basketball left, and his sharpshooter will be making his return for the 2022 season, where the system will once again be in place. They've got a young pick with a bright future in Wiseman, and plenty left in the tank to make it back to the top with the same core that was organically built many years ago. The Golden Dynasty was just one era he helped author, and now that we know he can do this regardless of circumstance, the league should fear what comes next in the story of Steph Curry's career.